This is my final presentation by Katelyn Milligan. What topic am I discussing? How Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul provided so much for the women's suffrage movement. I will also give a brief overview of the women's suffrage movement. What does Through Women's Eyes talk about, and how will my sources expand on their discussion? Through Women's Eyes does give a brief overview of the women's suffrage movement by focusing on the organizations within the movement. It also goes into detail how diversity worked in the movement. My sources will build on this discussion by looking into two influential leaders, Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul. My first source, the Women's Revolution. My first source is an article titled The Women's Revolution, and it was written by Beatrice Forbes Robinson Hill. Hill was an author of the women's suffrage movement, so this first source is a primary and credible source. In Hill's article, she explains the triumphs of the women's suffrage movement while also explaining the birth control movement and women's marital status. She explains how the suffrage movement has exploded the women's workforce, among many other things. In regards to the birth control movement, she explains the effects of it are very unclear due to the stances of people in the movement. She also explains how women have transformed their marital statuses by marrying late or getting divorced. My second source, The Woman and Her Work. My second article, The Woman and Her Work, is written by Ida Husted Harper, who was an American author and suffragist who also wrote the biography on Susan B. Anthony. This article explains who Susan B. Anthony is and how she came to be a woman suffragist leader. This article emphasizes the power and strength she had to be the leader she was. This article also emphasizes that Anthony was not only an active voice in the women's suffrage movement, but also other movements like the abolition of slavery. Here is a quote from the article. No one who makes a careful study of the great movement for the emancipation of women can fail to recognize in Miss Anthony's its supreme leader. Page 604. The sources this author uses is the biography that Harper wrote on Anthony and articles that Anthony wrote herself. My third source, New Life in an Old Movement. My third source looks at Sidney R. Bland's article, New Life in an Old Movement, Alice Paul and the Great Suffrage Parade of 1913 in Washington, D.C. Bland was a professor of history at James Madison University and a credible author. This article first looks at what was happening before Alice Paul entered the movement, and then looks into who Alice Paul is and how she contributed. This next quote explains the tactics that Alice Paul used for the suffrage movement. Into this vacuum came new militant leadership and dramatic, unprecedented tactics designed to gain the widest possible publicity for the suffrage cause. The new leadership came in the person of Alice Paul, a young New Jersey Quaker, and her techniques of persuasion were borrowed from English militant suffrage movement, page 659. The article then goes into how she was essential to the Washington, D.C. suffrage parade of 1913. The author uses letters from Miss Paul and uses other secondary sources to help back their information about Paul. How does my sources expand the discussion? Sources expand the discussion of the women's suffrage movement by three ways. One, it introduced two different leaders of the suffrage movement. Two, touched on topics of the suffrage movement a bit more than Through Women's Eyes does. And three, showed how each of these leaders provided so much more for the suffrage movement. Lastly, here are my sources, which includes Through Women's Eyes. Thank you.